Ja, grüezi miteinander, ich bin der Eldritch. Ist es nicht lieb von Wargaming, dass sie uns zur Feier vom Oktoberfest die deutsche Kreuzer geben? Also ich weiß ja nicht, wie es euch geht, aber ich freue mich tierisch, endlich deutsche Kreuzerspiele zu kennen. Aber da habe ich jetzt auch lange genug hier sabbelt, wa? Und ich denke, es ist jetzt an der Zeit, dass wir uns die schönen Dinge mal angucken. What's up everyone, I'm Eldritch, and as you've probably already heard, the stats for the German cruisers and the Soviet destroyers have been introduced into the game, and all you have to do is install one of the very many mods in order for you to see them. So you could, for example, go with Aslane's mod pack, and you could look at the stats in the game yourself. However, you know me, I like to compare ship stats and then judge those ships accordingly based on their merit, and I'm going to do the same thing now with the German ships and tomorrow with the Soviet ships. Now first of all, there are a few things about the German cruisers that we cannot really see in the stats, because Wargaming is still keeping those stats secret, but much smarter people than me who have dug around in the files have found out all these interesting tidbits. Amongst them, the German cruisers will have the highest shell velocity amongst any cruisers in the game, and they will also have the flattest gun arc, so their guns work in very much the same way as the Tierpitz's guns. The accuracy is somewhere between the Americans and the Japanese, so it's not overly amazing, but it's going to be good enough, and with all of these factors combined, it does mean that the German cruisers will be able to really use their incredibly long range that they have. Or at least that's the theory. We'll see how it actually plays out in the game, because of course there have not been any cruisers with as much range as the Germans are going to have. Next, I cut down the stats that I'm actually going to compare a little bit to these sort of essentials, and as such I didn't include the armor values. In general, the German cruisers have a lot less armor than both the Americans and the Japanese. Yes, even the weakly armored Japanese cruisers are better armored than the German cruisers. The German cruiser line is very much a line of light cruisers, and as such their armor just is atrocious. I am however told that German ships in general had an additional belt of armor that was sloped and protected the citadel. So we'll have to see how that actually works out in the game, if that just means that the German citadel hit zones are really small or difficult to hit, or exactly how that is going to affect the gameplay with them. But keep it in mind, it could be interesting for later. The shitty armor does definitely mean that high explosive is going to be a lot more effective against them, and AP rounds, specifically 203mm AP rounds, are going to over-penetrate them a lot more, I would imagine. But now let's get down to the ships. First of all, wow, there's so much variety now at Tier 1, because we received both the Hamelin and the Orlan. Now anyone who's been watching my content with any sort of regularity knows that I really don't like the Hashidate. I think it was a massive downgrade from the Katori. I personally find the Erie to be a much better ship, and I do think that both the Hamelin and the Orlan really show why I think that. Now while the Hashidate is now the ship with the most hit points at Tier 1, those 1000 hit points are really not going to do all that much in the end. What is however going to make a difference is that the German and the Soviet cruisers have such an incredibly high top speed. 24.3 and 25.3 knots respectively is a really great top speed for that tier, especially because they are more or less just as maneuverable as the other Tier 1 ships. Gun-wise, I think both the Hamelin and the Orlan are much better than the Hashidate, given the Hamelin has awful high explosive rounds, and this is sadly something that all the German cruisers share. All the German cruisers in the game have really bad high explosive ammunition. Both the damage and the fire chance are incredibly low. And as such, in general, they are going to have a very hard time defending themselves against battleships. And it's also going to be a little bit more difficult for these ships to deal with destroyers. The Hamelin also has the second weakest AP ammunition, but to make up for that it has an insane rate of fire of 15 rounds per minute. It fires twice as often, the Erie, and at that point its high explosive damage doesn't even look that bad anymore. How this really plays out, we'll have to see, but so far I think the Hamelin and Orlan are both going to perform a little bit better than the Hashidate, and I think they're probably going to be sort of even on with the Erie. Kind of depends on how big their citadels are. Looking at them, I'm probably going to have the most fun with the Orlan, because the 130mm guns that it has are the same that you can find on the Gremiashi right now. And having those Tier 5 destroyer guns at Tier 1 sounds fantastic. Now we're of course looking at the cruisers, and thus the Soviet destroyers are falling away. And we're going to instead just compare the German cruisers to the Japanese and the American cruisers. And I have to say I'm not entirely sure what to think of these low tier German cruisers. Hit points and maneuverability wise they look fine, but their guns are really weird, as they are the first cruisers to only sport 105mm guns. and only doing 1200 high explosive damage could be a really big problem, even at tier 2. I think that the Dresden's guns are going to have big problems trying to smash through the armor of the Chikuma and the Chester. It does once again have the insane 15 rounds per minute rate of fire, and its fire chance is of course also pretty rubbish. The only other ships in the game with low caliber guns like this are the low tier American destroyers, and I do definitely know that their guns have issues smashing through cruisers. So if that is also the case for the Dresden, then that is going to be a damn big problem for this ship. If the guns can deal their damage, then I think the Dresden is going to be just fine at tier 2, but if they don't, then I think this is going to be a real stinker. The Kolberg, I'm pretty damn sure, is going to be a real stinker. And the problem that I'm having with this ship is that the guns are so short ranged and are still only 105mm caliber. You're going to have a really hard time at a tier where you have two ships as amazing as the Tenryu and the St. Louis. These ships are so incredibly good that they are just going to make the Kolberg look relatively bad. And while those guns may be fine at tier 2, I do not believe they are going to be anywhere close to fine at tier 3. With the Karlsruhe at tier 4, we're getting the first look of what the cruiser line is really all about. Finally, we have 150mm guns, which look to be pretty competitive with what is already out there in the Kuma's 140mm guns and the Phoenix's 152mm guns. The Karlsruhe is also a rather stealthy ship, but it is definitely also the slowest ship at this tier. And while the 6km range German torpedoes aren't all that fancy anymore at the higher tiers, they are definitely still very good at tier 4. I mean, just compare them to the Kuma's torpedoes. Except for having 1km less range, they are actually very comparable. Again, I think the high explosive damage and the fire chance on all of these ships is going to be their biggest drawback. But they all share it, so we'll just have to get used to it. Now when we get to tier 5, things get really interesting because the Königsberg is a really sweet looking ship. Finally, we have a German ship with some speed, and we have the first German ship that has a multiple gun turret setup. Whereas the Furutaka still has single gun turrets, and the Omaha has the famous mixed gun turrets. The Königsberg comes with 3 turrets of 3 guns each. However, it should be noted, 2 of these turrets are mounted aft, only one of the turrets is mounted on the bow. That is definitely an important detail, but it does mean that the Königsberg has a better firepower than the Omaha without the top hull. The Omaha that I have listed here is with the second hull, not the final hull. So this is even before it loses that one aft turret and one of its torpedo launchers. And still the Königsberg has more guns. Also, it has 16.5km range on its guns. Damn, that is a far-reaching ship. I think out of all of the ships in the German line, the Königsberg is the most interesting and looks to be the strongest. The torpedoes are decent, the guns are really nice, it is long-ranged, and it is a relatively fast ship on top. All in all, the Königsberg looks fantastic and I really want to get my hands on it. It's just a shame that you have to struggle through so much garbage to get it. And with the Nürnberg at tier 6, we can see sort of the trend of the German ships. Always the least amount of armor. Sadly, not really the fastest ships either. The Nürnberg, I would assume, is going to have the defensive fire ability. At least the Auba and the Cleveland have it. And so the AA stats definitely become interesting. And if you always thought that the Japanese cruisers had relatively bad anti-aircraft, then holy crap are you going to be disappointed by these mid-tier German cruisers, because their anti-aircraft is even worse. 72 AA DPS is really nothing at tier 6. Apart from that, the Nürnberg introduces the final torpedoes that the German ships have. All the German cruisers have these torpedoes, 6km range, 64 knots speed, which is pretty damn fast, 13,700 damage, and a 68-second reload. Now these torpedoes are really nice, but they are definitely not offensive torpedoes. They are very much defensive in nature and not as broadly usable as the Japanese torpedoes. Anyone who's played an Auba or a Miyoko or any of the other higher tier Japanese cruisers knows that the 10km range on those torpedoes is really good and can be used in a lot of situations, where it is a lot more difficult to use the 6km range torpedoes on these German ships. Gun-wise, the Nürnberg has exactly the same setup as the Königsberg at tier 5. Only difference being that it has 2 rounds per minute more rate of fire. It even has the same range of 16.5 kilometers, which is of course not as impressive anymore at tier 6, but it is still the highest range at tier 6, so who's going to complain? Still, however, do keep in mind that the guns are still mounted in the exact same way. You have 2 aft gun turrets and 1 bow turret. So it's not always going to be too easy to bring your guns to bear when you're driving these German cruisers. At tier 7 we have the York, which has nothing to do with the British town of York or the American town of New York, but has in fact to do with Generalfeldmarschall Ludwig York von Wartenburg, who was a very high-ranking officer in the Prussian army. The York has the lowest amount of hit points, is the slowest ship at this tier, but it is a little bit more maneuverable than the Miyoko. But now we transition to the German 210mm guns instead of the 150mm guns. And sadly, with this transition, we also lose 2 guns. And so the York is down to 4 turrets of 2 guns each, 2 of those turrets mounted aft, 2 of those turrets mounted on the bow. It does have the highest rate of fire amongst these ships, which is pretty good because its IP damage is actually not that far behind the other 2. But sadly, once again, the high explosive damage is so incredibly bad on this ship. I think the guns are fine, but the problem is definitely that it only has 8 guns compared to the Miyoko's 10 and the Pensacola's 10. Cruisers are all about DPS, and having 2 guns less is a big deal. Yes, the rate of fire is higher, but with less guns and less damage on the shells, it's impossible for that rate of fire to make up for that. It of course still has the same torpedoes as the Nürnberg, and luckily it has actually some pretty good anti-aircraft. The Admiral Hipper has the most hit points at tier 8. It is still the slowest ship and now the maneuverability is also not that great anymore. But the real problem that I have with the Admiral Hipper is that it still only has 8 guns. And now the rate of fire even went down. This is of course because the York had 210mm guns, whereas the Admiral Hipper has 203mm guns. I'm not entirely sure where these guns come from and why they're suddenly 203 and not the 210mm guns, as are usually a bit more common in Germany, but that's just what it is. Sadly, the real problem is that the Mogami at tier 8 is such an incredibly strong cruiser with its 1555mm guns. The amount of damage that the Mogami can put out, the Admiral Hipper just cannot compare with. And while it does have longer range, I feel that it is a bit lacking at this tier. I'm really not so sure why the Admiral Hipper had to be the tier 8 ship. I think it could easily have gotten a little bit reduced hit points and been put at tier 7, and then we could have seen some other stupid paper ship at tier 8 instead of having the fictional York at tier 7. The Rhone once again with 49,500 hit points, quite a bit better than both the Ibuki and the Baltimore, but as all the other German cruisers, its speed is rather lacking. But at least there's one good thing about it: it finally gains an additional gun and we're up to 9. And you could say, but the Baltimore also has only 9 guns. Well, that's true, but the Baltimore is the one that gains a damage upgrade on its ammunition, and now it does 5,000 AP damage at 2,800 HE damage, whereas the Rhone still only does 4,800 and 2,300. The Rhone is not that far behind, and I think it's a fine cruiser at tier 9. And then we come to the tier 10 Hindenburg. Still the most hit points at the tier, but atrocious armor just like all the other ones. Lowest speed and rubbish maneuverability, gets spotted at 16 kilometers range. The Hindenburg is pretty much a battleship, but it does have 12 203mm guns, just like the Zao, only that it has 0.6 better rate of fire. But then again, the Zao's ammunition is much better and does so much more damage. And the Des Moines is of course crazy with its 10 rounds per minute, and all that combined, I think the Hindenburg just isn't as good as the Zao or the Des Moines. Both the Zao and the Des Moines do things in a very specific way, and they do those things well. The Des Moines is just a gun cruiser, and the Zao has really powerful torpedoes. The Hindenburg still has the exact same stupid torpedoes that you already had at tier 6. And the guns really aren't that fantastic. The only thing that it really has over the other two is a tiny amount more hit points and a slightly higher range at 17.8 kilometers. And suddenly the best anti-aircraft DPS at the tier, for whatever silly reason. All in all, most of these German cruisers seem rather lacking in my opinion. It's great that they have such a long range, and if they can use it, then that's awesome. But the high explosive on these is so bad that battleships will be pretty much impossible to do anything against. And when you're firing at cruisers and destroyers, it is so easy for them to dodge your shots if you fire at those kind of ranges. We'll have to of course see how much better the velocity in the low shell arc is going to make your shell travel time. If you can fire at 16-17 kilometers and it takes only like 8 or 9 seconds for your shells to get there, then that range is of course just good news. But I think that really remains to be seen. Any of the German cruisers with a 3-turret setup, that being the Königsberg, Nürnberg and Rhone, have those 2 turrets mounted on the aft. That can really be a significant disadvantage, especially on the Königsberg, where the turrets are also not both mounted in the middle, but one is sort of mounted right and the other one is sort of left. That's gonna make it a lot harder for you to actually aim both turrets at the same target without completely exposing your broadside. It makes you very good at running away, but running away isn't really a proper strategy in World of Warships all of the time. Sometimes that is going to give you an advantage, but I would argue that it is a little bit better to be good at being aggressive than it is to be good at running away. The torpedoes are just too short range to be really universally good. There are going to be situations where you can use your torpedoes and they are going to win you the day by just absolutely annihilating a battleship or another cruiser. But in most cases the torpedoes really aren't going to do all that much for you. I may of course be completely wrong and they turn out to be amazing, but as a whole, except for the Königsberg, I find them rather underwhelming. Especially the Kolberg, Karlsruhe, York and Admiral Hipper seem rather awful. But I am definitely looking forward to the Königsberg, and if nothing else I'm at least grinding to tier 5 to get that jewel of a ship. Watch it get nerfed next patch. Alright folks, that's it for this quick evaluation. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and if you have any feedback, leave it in the comments. Tune in tomorrow to find out all about the Soviet destroyers and how they measure up against the other destroyers that are already in the game. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video.